Aroffo. I'm Ernie Aroffo. I got first word of the military service following D-Day, December the 7th, and all of my friends decided they would enlist, and so I took the word and went in. At downtown Detroit, we had a warehouse building that was called the Ladies' Corset Building. It was a brick building, and I went in and stripped down. They put me through all the rigmarole and then stepped up in front of the big A, because they used the A chart where we use now the E chart, but the A chart, they directed me to it, and I looked at it and I couldn't see the A. So they said, step down. I said, what now? And they said, well, we can't take you because your vision isn't good enough. I said, well, I'd like to get in the service. Well, he said, your vision will improve because they'll draft you. And sure enough, in 6 months, I was drafted. So I went in that year in boy, isn't that awful that you forget what year it was?
Did you go after the first of the year, 42?
42, that's it. In 42, and I was into the service in October of 42, and then we went immediately to Fort Custer, and I have a little picture here of the group, and surprisingly, the captain there must have noticed that I was 6'3", 136 pounds, and he said, I'd like you to stay. So I stayed there for 2 years. In the meantime, went to Camp McCoy and got our basic training. The captain said, well, I have a friend who was the commander of that base at Camp McCoy in Wisconsin. Just speak to the captain, tell him my name, and ask him if he would send you back. Well, sure enough, he did, and I returned to Fort Custer and spent the rest of 42 and 43 there, and then came the intention of the Army to increase the troops, and so I was sent to Fort Sheridan, and we were put into a service group there for about 6 months, and then the word came that we were to go into a field hospital group in Camp Grant in Illinois. There were to be 3 units, and I was in the first unit. That wasn't anything more than just being a barracks with a group of men. And then we went to Raleigh, North Carolina, where we had our final instruction and so on. And one day an interesting thing happened. We were lined up and a lieutenant general came through, and because of my height, I was always the first one in the group. And he asked me a question. He said, Sergeant? No, he says, soldier, what is a map? I had just read my manual and I recited to him, well, sir, a map is a graphic portion of the Earth's surface. He looked at the colonel, our colonel, and said, that's your first sergeant. So from that point on, I was the first sergeant of the first platoon. Now this was to be a field hospital. We were to follow one of the armies and prepare for 400 patients. We had 400 beds, 2 large tents for the hospital, and then a tent for the mess group and one for the officers. And we arrived at Normandy Beach in October of 45. Would it be 45 or 44?
44.
44.
After D-Day.
Yeah, after D-Day, that's right. See, the dates are slipping me now. Anyhow, we arrived in the water of an open landing barge and walked in the water onto the shore. And the first thing we saw was this steep embankment against the water, and we had to go up a winding trail. And looking over to the left, I saw for the first time a soldier's cemetery. And of course, the crosses were all lined up in squares, like corn stalks, and all in beautiful white. And we turned our back and continued on. And then our first assignment was for a very brief one in Nancy, France. In December of that year was the Battle of the Bulge, and we were called at once to Belgium. At Belgium, some interesting things happened. I was out in the courtyard about midnight, and we were unloading equipment at the side of the building, and all of a sudden a Messerschmitt came through and strafed me. It wasn't any further than I am to the camera, which was about 3 feet. The pebbles just went all over me, and I thought, oh boy, how fortunate. Our next stop after being in Belgium was going on to Luxemburg, Edelbrook. In Edelbrook, we had 2 buildings that had been hospital buildings for the Germans during the Battle of the Bulge, but the buildings were under construction, so were all open walls, and I was going through to find where we would put this and that. The other thing, I got into the attic, and the roof had been blown out. There was another hole, and I just looked out, and just then along comes a Messerschmitt and strafed me again. Fortunately, missed me by a couple of feet. We stayed in Edelbrook, and I'm going to refer to a little memorandum that I kept that started a few months later, and this is the memento that I have, and this is a picture of our men a little later on. And on this is the picture of this memento and the men. Now, we had 29 men, 2 nurses and 2 doctors in the beginning. But this was a little bit later. This is towards the middle or just after the April ending of the war. Wasn't it in April or May?
In 45?
Yeah. This would have probably been the end of April, and we were in a German SS training camp, and we accumulated a few more doctors and a few more men because the other 2 groups couldn't keep up with the Third Army. Our intent was to keep up with the Third Army and provide emergency surgery specializing in the chest and belly within 45 minutes of the hit. And very few of the men survived. And then we were, of course, evacuated those who did survive to evacuation hospitals. We crossed the Rhine at near Metz in Germany, and this was another mountain ridge. And at the point, I looked down from where we were at a high point, looking down to the Rhine River, and we went across on a pontoon bridge, and up above there were German snipers. And I thought at the time, wow, it's a good thing I didn't get into the engineers, which I had applied for at OCS, and for some reason or other, I never got the call. Once we got to Cimmern, I was looking at my 201 file because I was the first sergeant, and I turned to my captain. I said, Captain, how come I was appointed to go to Maryland to the officers training school? And the colonel was there. He said, well, Ernest, Sergeant Aroffo, what happened was when we were back in North Carolina, I had my table of organization, TO. Everything was assigned. I was a leaf colonel. If one of you left, I couldn't have had my chicken colonel. So we never told you. A few days later, I talked with one of the doctors, and he said, well, Aroffo, you were 6'3" and 135 pounds. 1 pound less, and we would never have taken you. I said, this is a heck of a time to tell me. Anyhow, incidentally, since that time when I got out of the Army, I was 186, and I've lost 3 inches, so I'm now just 6 foot. But I'm not 100, I'm 170 pounds right now, and we watch it very closely. But when we were in Cimmern, rather in Metz, we had quite a snowstorm. The Third Army was the group that we followed. We were all set up to go with our first unit. And the second day, a call was sent out that we needed a volunteer to go into the snowfield to pick up a man who was still alive, but pretty well covered by snow and injured in a minefield. So I said, okay, I'll go along, took 1 other man, we went out with a litter, picked up the man, brought him back, and that was it. And I didn't hear anything further until this picture that I showed you here, which happened about 3 or 4 months later. We were in a SS camp for our billets, and we had received a number of Russian prisoners of war who had been in a Stalag, which I'll tell you about in a minute if we have time to get to it. When we were assembled, all of a sudden a Jeep pulled up, and what should it be but a well-dressed military general with a polished helmet, and what did they wear, chaps or something, and went up about the knee, and it turned out to be General Patton.
Jodhpurs? Was he wearing jodhpurs, like riding pants? Or?
Yes.
Oh, goodness.
And he stood up and he said, "Sergeant Aroffo, front and center." So I went front and center, and he said, "We're going to give you the Bronze Star for what you did back at Metz." Well, skipping the story way up, when I was finally discharged from Camp Atterbury in 1946, it was in January the 5th, we had 5,000 men standing out in a field ready to go, everybody anxious to go. All of a sudden, here goes the PA system, "Sergeant Aroffo, front and center." So I came up to the platform, and here was a full colonel, or full general, and he said, "We're going to give you the Bronze Star." I said, "Well, I already received one from General Patton." "Oh, he was just a lieutenant general at the time. You have to have a full 4-star general to do it." So I got 2 Bronze Stars, one for mother, one for my wife. Well, let's see, shall we talk more about what happened? You probably will find that most soldiers won't tell you about the sorry side of the stories, but we did go to one area where the Stalag was, and I've heard people saying that there was no such thing as these concentration camps. Well, we were into a concentration camp, and we were there to do one thing: delouse these people, pass them through a gate, and on this side they were clean, on that side they were unclean. Because we were medics, we had to care for them. But I went into one of the barracks, and I would like to describe by words if I can. It would have been a room about 20 feet wide and 40 feet deep, with wooden 2x4s making up the beds that reached about 4 tiers high. In each of the bunks there was a throwing of straw, and each man was one on top of the other. And the one on top, of course, had bowel problem or bladder problem, and the guy on the bottom received all of this waste. And the rooms were a horrible order. Men that probably were as big and tall as I was at one time were just skeletons, in effect. We were given 100 of them when we were at the area that I told you about, this picture at Simmern, at Hohenfels. And we were told that we would be given 100 of them, and I asked the commanding officer, "How many do you think we can save?" He said, "If you can save half of them, we'll be satisfied." The truth is, we didn't save half of them. On a daily basis, the Burgermeister from the city came in and picked up on a flat jeep those who were deceased. And it just went on for the days that we were there. And this little directory that I mentioned here is from Stalag 12. I picked up a Bible that had been abandoned because the Germans and their chaplain had left. And I picked it up and I thought, well, this would be a great place to write down my series of events, and that's what all of this is, so I can sort of remember it as to where I was in Nuremberg and the various cities that we went to and traveled through. There was one case that was sort of interesting when we were back at Metz, and this would be a historical event. We were standing one morning very early, about 5 to 6 o'clock in the morning, and all of a sudden there was a drone of airplanes. We looked up in the air, and here were big bombers passing over, wingtip to wingtip, heading east. It took about 2 hours before they were cleared. Then about 3:30, 4 o'clock, they returned the other way. And again, the sky was just full of these bombers. Well, we didn't give it any thought, but shortly thereafter, because we only stayed at these places about 3 days to keeping up with the army of the Third Army, because they moved so rapidly in their tanks, we were to go to Simmern. So I got in the Jeep, I was the lead man, and then the rest of the group followed with our 2.5-ton truck, an ambulance, and a Jeep, another Jeep, and then a field vehicle. And that all had to be loaded with our equipment. And I went ahead, it's called the advanced party. We went through a city called Cologne. Yes, it was Cologne. Now what happened was, we were advised, that was the city where these bombers had bombed. The city was completely bombed, completely leveled. I stood up in my Jeep, put my arm out like this and went around 360 degrees, nothing above my arm except the cathedral. Friends have been back and told me that the whole city is rebuilt, and the cathedral had never been touched. The thing that was so interesting to me was the cleanliness and the hard work of the German people. When we arrived, which was less than 10 days of this event, everything on the streets had been cleared, the bricks were piled up in piles, and of course flowers and little mementos everywhere, but nothing above my hand as I went around in the circles. I did find that when we returned to France, the debris was still there. We returned to England on the discharge route, and the debris was still there. So I always admired the Germans for that. One of the cities we stopped in was Grafenwöhr, and this was another evidence of the atrocities that happened by the SS troops. I went to a very large barn, and somebody said, "You got to see this." The barn was probably about 40 feet or 50 feet deep and about 30 feet wide, and height like you see in the average farm barn. And from the floor to the ceiling, the full coverage of the whole floor area were nothing but prostheses, arms and legs, that had been saved from soldiers and people who had been conquered by the SS troops. They seemed to want to save things, why I don't know, but it was just a sight to see. There's just piles of arms and legs and prostheses. Incidentally, that was the same town where we received some very interesting hospitality. We were housed at the time at Das Golf Hotel. That was a German hotel golf course. We had some nice billets at times, and one of the neighbors, villagers, invited us for a dinner. So myself and 2 or 3 of the men went. We sat at a table about the size of our dining room table there, about 10 feet long and 4 feet wide, enough for all of us who were there. And the meal that they presented probably was something like lentils or rice with a little milk. And that was all they had to eat because their food was so scarce. I thought, what a sweet thing to share that with us in appreciation that we had saved them from there. The thing that intrigued me was in the course of my going through these cities, I never found anybody who was a Nazi. And they'd say, "Das SS? Nein, nix, not us." So it was wonderful that they were able to retain their identity and claim that they were not a part of it. I just wondered at the time, but most of them were in pretty good health if they were outside of a city. You know, the meager-looking people were in the concentration camps or in the city, but of course the farmers had their food and so forth. I can't think of any other things except that we, when we had finally gotten to Nuremberg, gee, I don't know if I should tell you this. Maybe you'll want to edit them. When we got to Nuremberg, it was our final stop as a setup. We took over 2 former German hospital buildings. They were very big as the Ford Center at the Boulevard in Detroit and Hamilton Avenue, which is the Lodge Highway. And I looked at that hospital in Detroit, and they told me there was 400 beds, and I thought, oh my gosh, a great big building like that, and we had 400 beds with 29 men and 2 nurses and 2 doctors. But, oh dear, I lost my train of thought there for a minute. Tell me, what were we talking about?
In Nuremberg.
Oh, in Nuremberg, yes. It was our last stop, and we were in, for billets, a former school building, I guess it was. And I looked out the window, and there I could see, lined up like a cornfield, thousands upon thousands of tanks, bumper to bumper, side to side, as far as you could see. And then the far distance was where our hospitals were to be. There were 2 buildings for 2 specialties. And I apologize for having to tell you this. But when we were back in Belgium, it started. We were told that we were allowed a liquor allowance, and we sent a 2.5-ton truck loaded with booze brought back because we had 400 beds. Now, of course, there was only 29 men that could use the liquor. And I was the first sergeant and passed out the liquor, and of course I didn't drink it. That's why they let me do it. But the problem that developed showed up in Nuremberg, alcoholism, and the men went to delirium tremens. The other thing was the venereal disease. They had time off, and the men were meeting with the young ladies in France, Belgium, Luxemburg, Germany. And those, of course, as soon as they showed up, because we had physical checks with regularity, and that would show up either the alcoholism or the venereal disease. I don't think I've ever heard anybody discuss that, because they wouldn't have been in the hospital. I worry to think about the boys coming back from Iraq, Iran, Afghanistan. I hope they've been kept clean. It's such a temptation. You're away from home. What do? When we were back in North Carolina, I'll never forget, we went into town, and the first thing that happened, the guy said, well, come on, we'll go in and have a drink, and then next door were the tattoo shops. When we got overseas, one of the fellows who had just gotten married and got word from his wife that they were having a baby, he showed up. And this was when we were still back, not in the operation, we were in C-39, a physical check in the morning, out in the field in our pump tents. He was caught with the VD, and of course the first thing that happened, he was removed out of the service and back home. Well, beyond that, I can say that I did enjoy the time I was there. We had freedom of being just a small group, and we moved with rapidity. The headquarters group would join us from time to time, and they went from unit to unit. Our unit seemed to be the most stable one, because this one picture that I showed you here, there's about 50 people in the picture, and so we had grown, and where the other groups were denied. Our group now meets as veterans, and we've had annual meetings, but the last one I went to, which was 2 years ago, there were only 10 of us left of the whole group. Of course, they're all in their 80s now, and some of them are less lucid as I am and able to speak. Many of them, the heads pop up and down, and they'll just say yes and no. Beyond that, I am grateful for my opportunity to have served in the Army and in the 3rd Army, in ETO, and we receive buttons and honors and awards and so on. They're scattered around the house on the walls. Beyond that, God bless you all. I hope any of that you go into the service are able to come out as solid as I've been able to return, as I'm now 87 years of age. Amen. Is that good enough?
Well, that's very good, sir. May I ask a few questions and,
Sure.
and have you follow up a little bit? You told us a little bit about the work that you were doing with the mobile hospital unit. What did your personal duties consist of? Were you mostly going in and setting things up and taking things down when you moved, or what kinds of things did you do
Well, I was
day
the
to day?
first sergeant, so I had control of all the duties.
Ah,
My timing was more like 24 hours. The family noticed when I got back home that I could fall asleep at any moment, and that's how I got my sleep when I was in the service. As I mentioned, the one time that I went in the Jeep, that was my task, to go to our destined spot, which was Cimarron. That was a city where we weren't in the tents all the time. We were, some of you have seen that program called MASH. Well, we were the prototype for MASH. See, they were in tents and they moved from place to place, usually at an airstrip. We had one airstrip experience, but beyond that, we were within the cities. Cimarron was an example. It was a city with residential houses and so on. We were in one of the residential houses. A funny thing happened in Cimarron. Keller was his name. He was a cook. He decided he wanted to cook a chicken. So he got a couple of chickens, put them in the washing machine in the basement, and turned the thing on. I said, "What are you doing?" He said, "I'm making chicken soup." Now, what's the next question?
So you would kind of describe your unit maybe as similar to the MASH television show, but without the helicopters coming in all the time? Is that?
We only had one instance of that. Beyond that, we would go out and set up, and there would be ambulances that would bring these people in.
So other than people moving on the ground, it was similar to that.
Well, we would move on. In other words, The Third Army was just ahead of us, and we had to be back to within 15 minutes of when a soldier was injured on the battlefield, wherever he was, whether it was in a tank, on the street, or a foot soldier. The Third Army was mostly mechanized, you know.
What, how did the routine work when you took down the mobile unit and then when you put it back up again? How would you describe how that worked?
Well, let me tell you the funny side of the story. I never drank coffee because the mess line had 4 GI cans. They were like ash cans. One was for our after dinner. It had a garbage can where we dumped the residue, and then we had rinse water, and then we had soapy water, and then the 4th one was the coffee urn. It was on a Bunsen burner, and I often thought, well, which one of those was the garbage can? And, you know, in a hurry, they just put things together, and that's what we did. We would dismantle everything and had to, at its place. The tents had to be folded, the blankets had to be put together, the cots had to be broken down, and we had the 2.5-ton truck just loaded with it, and it got heavier all the time. The other problem was the accumulation of equipment. If any of you read of War and Peace of Napoleon, and how the problem was when they got into Russia, they had accumulated so much what we call legal looting, they couldn't hardly move. Well, these guys had the same thing. And that was kind of an interesting thing. Do I dare digress here? On the way home from Camp Atterbury from Kilmore at the Atlantic coast to Camp Atterbury in Indiana, the guys would throw their equipment out because they didn't want to carry it anymore. So I went before a general who asked me to speak to him about this, and I said, look, this is ridiculous. Don't make them carry all that stuff on the train. Have a showdown back in Camp Kilmore when we came out of the service so that they would be lightened up. And you'll save all this equipment that's being thrown out of the train. So I found later that that's what they've done. They don't let them carry all this stuff. They have to keep only their Army equipment, because some of them had all kinds of things. Next question.
Could you tell us a little bit about what came after the service, maybe whether or not things that happened in your life afterward were closely related with what happened in the service, or was it really quite different and you went on to other adventures?
Of course, when I got into the service, even Don and I had been courting for 2 years, and we decided we wanted to get married. The family didn't approve. I think they had other reasons for that, for fear of children being born while I was overseas, so we didn't. However, having spent 2 years in the service before I went overseas, we finally decided we'd make up our own mind, and we said we wanted to get married. That was our final stop at Camp Grant in Indiana, or Illinois. And I got the furlough. We all had the furloughs, and we had planned that we would get married in July. Let's see, that would be July the 14th, yeah. The 14th of July, 1944. And we had the wedding. We went to Niagara Falls, and immediately I went back to service, and the story followed. On the return home, they gave us excellent transportation. Went by Air Force to the old Detroit airport, the downtown Detroit airport, which was on the east side, and the family greeted us and so on. And you asked me what I did then. Well, my father had started a business for me in floor covering. We were floor covering merchants, carpeting, linoleum, window shades, Venetian blinds, and Oriental rugs, which was my love, and his love. And we were together for 40 years in business, and he passed in the interval, and we continued in Detroit, and then we closed our stores there, moved to Northville here, so that it'd be on the other side. That's Wayne County, and our home here is in Oakland County. I wanted to see the difference in the taxes. An interesting point about the Detroit business, we had a very good business, did a lot of work for General Motors and Chrysler, many of the automotive people, for their big buildings, and we had what we call a battleship. This was before you saw tile or wood floors. The battleship was a thick 5'1", what's a quarter of an inch? 4, what? 16th, 5/16. That's the word.
Okay.
See, it's been so long. And the battleship was put in the Ford plant in Highland Park. And the strange thing happened when the men got to the end of the width of the room, great big rooms. And these battleship rolls were 100 square yards and heavy as all get out. It took several of us to carry them, to get them into the buildings. They said, we're short one roll. I said, how could that be? I measured it myself. Well, it turned out that they had not anticipated that they'd have to cut a seam. So with each roll, they lost an inch. By the time they got to the width of the room, they lost a roll. Since that time, all of the rolls had a ½ an inch extra in the width. But we continued in Illinois in business in Detroit, and we did a very good business there. Average sale was about $500 at that time, which was 1946 forward until we left in 1976. But out here, the average sale was $5,000.
Goodness.
So our business was very good, and I retired 5 years earlier than I thought I would. We retired in 1983. We lived over here in a condominium and got involved in city politics. I was the chairman of the planning commission that planned this project that you're in now, which was called Meadowbrook Commons. It's independent living. Mm-hmm. There's nobody here that needs assistance. And this is a ranch unit. There are 10 of these ranch buildings that surround a main building where it is like an apartment building. And I've been in the planning commission. I've been on the commission on recreation. I was on the commission that set the plan for this building. I dug the first shovel of dirt. I never thought we would come here. But I'm still a volunteer with the 52nd District Court. We act as counselors for people who come in because of the various problems, whether it be alcoholism or venereal disease or traffic toll, and they come into the building, they're scared stiff. And our role is to counsel with them, tell them what's going to happen, explain them the procedures as much as we can, but we are not lawyers, so we tell them that. But it's been an innovative idea of one of the judges that's here. He said, I want somebody to talk to people before they get into the court. And so that's what we do. And beyond that, I'm in the Rotary, I'm in the Chamber of Commerce. All these things are honorary because of what I've been on the other, so I don't have to go to the meetings, which is nice. And the Rotary is just a wonderful resource here in the city for things that they do are all over the world. I've never seen such generous people. They're all very wealthy. And sometimes I feel like I'm out of my score because I'm not earning anything anymore except on my portfolio, which has gone to pot, like everybody else's. What's your next question?
Well, I think maybe at this point we'll get a little closer look at some of the mementos that you have, some of the photographs and things. We'll set up and have you talk a little bit about some of the pictures and things that you've shown us while you were talking. Okay. We'll get a little closer look at that and kind of wrap it up.
Okay.
Okay, so we're looking at one of the pictures that you showed us while you were speaking on camera. Mm-hmm. And
well, we were all very well oriented to each other. This nurse and let's see, this is our chaplain. This was our dentist. Our surgeon disappeared. I can't remember just what happened to Slaughter was his name. They called him the Butcher of Bastogne. But he was a major, and he just loved to operate, and he had lots of patients to work on. This young man right here was Massioni, and he was the one who did all of our artwork. And I think I had a picture like this one of our first lieutenant, Lieutenant Fraser. And then that's myself. We all were wearing the helmets at the time. And oh yes, right there you can see is the edge of when I got the Bronze Star.
Let's move this a little bit to show the names of the folks who are in the shot.
Now these are the names of everybody that was there.
Yeah, and then anybody who looks at this later can freeze frame if they'd like to follow through and see all the names.
Now these two were closely related. Parker was one of the nurses,
And then on the other
this-
side, you had your
Yeah, now
notes. This
that's
is
the
your
notes, yeah. It started with
your
Fort
chronology.
Jackson, yeah, and it went down the line and showed where we were in various locations, if you can raise it, because somebody would remember that, I suppose.
Mm-hmm. Okay, let's take a look at one of your other
Perhaps
mementos.
this is the beginning of
Here we go.
at Fort Custer. I don't know any of those men, but that was our first uniform, and this is how the uniform improved with the buttons and the whatever this hat was. I forgot what it was called. And then this is the ETO symbol that we were to go into. And then this is a picture of us at Hohenfels that I've mentioned before, where the first time we had a shower. See, we had the shower equipment, but we had never had time to put it up. But at this place we did. One of the men was a plumber, so he put the plumbing equipment together and we had a shower in a tent.
Oh,
What an experience that was, because the ground got all full of mud, and you had to stand on a bench in order to get your slacks back on without them getting into the mud. But it was hot water, and we had the equipment to make the hot water, and the water came from a tower up above that had been damaged, but he put the thing back together again, so we had running water.
Okay, here's the citation for the Bronze Star. And it talks about meritorious service, and it doesn't mention the incident that seemed to bring that about when you rescued the man from the minefield. Do you know why that was? Did they not keep good records of General Patton's original awarding of the star, or how did that work out?
Probably not. I think that everything moves so rapidly, but somebody said it appeared on my record that I had the Bronze Star. And then they realized that it was Patton, and he didn't qualify. It had to be a full 4-star general to do it, so they did it the second time, and I had 2 stars. One for mother and one for my wife.
Uh-huh.
But as to where it happened, very often you'll notice that their statements are very brief.
Mm-hmm.
And this is briefly the statement that happened. It was official. See the notation there. Beyond that, well, this was the first group, as you went through a line, they sliced off about 30, 40 men and said, you're in and you're going to be in that building. And then they took a picture of us. And that was probably the afternoon or the morning that we got our uniforms, the first uniform.
And this is at Fort Custer, you said?
Fort Custer, yeah, in Battle Creek.
In Battle Creek. Ah,
I
okay.
think they say Battle Creek.
Oh,
Only we call it Battle Creek.
okay.
And then later on, when I got home, I had a dress overcoat, and then this is the ETO button. I don't know why I had that on, because if I had the ETO button, then that would have to have been after the service, and I wouldn't have worn the uniform later.
Mm-hmm.
But we must have known we were going into it.